Yes. Well, first of all, Barack, thank you for having me. Hi, everyone. Um, and I'm thrilled to be here. Yeah, it's been an interesting journey, and it's a fun day to talk about it because we've got, as you alluded to, a pretty important announcement that we made for Foundry. It probably affects us a lot more than it affects the industry, but I hope it's just maybe an example of how we've tried to do things a little bit differently at Foundry. But so I've been in venture for 23 years now. I started my career doing some sort of banking and then transactional roles. Eventually, became a manager and ran actually a very large business for basically business line for a public company, kind of back in the late 90s, early 2000s. And I transitioned over to venture in 2001. I always joke with people that it was a fortuitous time to get into venture. I already knew what was going on. I mean, it wasn't just that there was a party and the drinks had run out, but it was truly like the party was over, right? The cops had come and gone, and there was no one there. But I knew that getting into it. I had done because I had an operational background. I had done a little bit of workout work. I think that's what attracted me to joining venture in 2001. I worked for a very large Palo Alto-based venture fund called SoftBank Venture Capital. It was affiliated with SoftBank, and I worked there for a while. And eventually, realized that I didn't really have a career path at this large venture firm, and so I talked to my partner Brad Feld, who I'm sure many of your listeners know. And I said to him that I wasn't quitting, in that conversation, but that I was going to start looking around and think about the next thing to do. I wasn't excited to stay with SoftBank. It changed its name at that point to Mobius, but was not excited to stay with that platform. And he said, well, actually, I don't know that we're going to raise this fund. I've been thinking about doing something else, on my own, a little bit smaller, a little bit more focused on the kind of work that you and I have been doing here in Colorado. I had joined Brad in the Colorado office. And I should clarify, I worked for Brad at the time. He was my boss. And that's what started a series of conversations that led to founding Foundry. We had two of our other Mobius partners move out this is the summer of 2006. And then we raised our first fund in 2007. And it's been an unbelievable journey, certainly more. I was reflecting on it because I wrote something about it this morning. But it was more than I really ever could have imagined, right? We manage over $3 billion, and we've raised 8 funds. We were amongst the first VCs I think the first VC to try to syndicate on AngelList. We experimented with that. We experimented with creating a fund of funds, which I think is also quite unusual. I think we were the first sort of institutional GP to create a fund of funds in the way that we did. And so we've had a lot of fun along the way. And I hope, we've obviously made some interesting investments in companies all over, really primarily the US, but all over the US. And I hope have, added something ultimately to the venture ecosystem. I think what I'm perhaps most proud of is that we've assembled this group of partner funds. These are the investments that we've made in other funds. And I think that they represent some of the best sort of emerging managers out there, right? I hope that they will be the next generation of managers. So anyway, that's probably a longer answer than you wanted, but that's kind of the quick history of Foundry.
You mentioned that Foundry was designed from start to be a limited life partnership in your blog post. Why did you intentionally choose not to build Foundry as a generational firm?
So first, I should just clarify for the people that are listening that we're recording this on the morning that we announced that Foundry's 2022 fund, the fund that we just raised, will be our last fund. We're gonna wrap up, and I say just announced. I mean, truly, I think it was about an hour ago that I posted the post to the Foundry blog post, and then I wrote something on my own as well. And that, as Barack, you just referenced, had always sort of been the design principle of Foundry. When the 4 of us got together and started Foundry, we did a lot of work on sort of what type of platform we wanted to build. And that resulted in a series of decisions, some of which we've kind of played around with, and I'll talk about that in a second, but a bunch of decisions as we started. And those included things like we would do all the work ourselves, right? We really never seriously experimented with having associates or analysts or other people that sort of other firms have, right? We wanted to stay small and stay focused. We decided we wanted to raise, when we were doing just the early stage practice, the same fund every time. And so our first fund was $225 million. And then our second fund and our third fund and our fourth fund, they were all $225 million. It was only when we added on the fund of funds that we actually grew the size of the funds that we raised. So just things like that. And one of those things we talked about was it's really hard to transition ownership in a venture firm. You really have to be incredibly intentional about doing it. And for the four of us, even back then, right? I mean, it's funny to talk about it now, but I mean, the truth is we were, I was probably 33 at the time, talking about like, well, we don't want to have a generational firm. I mean, it all seems so far in the distance, right? This is nearly 20 years ago now, 18 years ago. But we felt like that was sort of part of what we were trying to build. We wanted to focus on the business of venture and not the business of firm building, right? So when you think about a lot of those decisions, they're related, not raising larger funds, not having analysts and associates, and not creating a generational firm are all kind of the same thing, which was our saying, no, we really want to focus solely on the work of investing. And so that's what we did. Now, in truth, we did experiment a little bit with the idea of creating a generational firm, right? We have brought on a couple of new partners, specifically Lyndall, who runs our fund of funds practice, and then also Chris Moody and Jacqueline Hester. And we did experiment, or at least have discussions in the last couple years about, well, what would it look like if we handed the reins over to Lyndall and Jacqueline and let them continue on with that. And I think we were quite open with that. Ultimately, it was actually their decision, right? They felt like, no, the Foundry platform and the Foundry ethos is so tied to the four founders of Foundry, and three of us are still there. My partner, Jason, retired a couple years ago. That I think that they ultimately came to the conclusion, which we very much supported because it was kind of back to first principles, that we should stick with the original plan and ultimately wrap up. So, I think it means different things to each of us, right? I mean, I think when I look across our partnership, I think we're all very focused for a while on the business of continuing to invest. We have several years. We're announcing early, right? We didn't want people to have the perception that we somehow couldn't raise or something bad had happened or something like that. And so we thought, well, once we've made the decision, we should probably announce it, and let's announce it sort of mid-cycle, right? We've got 2 years. We raised the fund in 2022. We had our last close about a year ago. So, we're really like in the heart of the investment cycle. We have at least 2 years left on to invest in new companies. And so we felt like this was a good time to kind of make that announcement. And that gives us plenty of time to kind of plan for what's next, right? I mean, we have another probably 15 years of managing Foundry. Hopefully not all of that ends up being full-time, but certainly I, for one, have raised my hand within Foundry and said, I will be here until the absolute end. And I have a lot of, I've been in venture for a long time. I like to think of myself as not like super old, right? I mean, I've just hit my early 50s. And so I've got a lot of energy and interest. But I also have a lot of energy and interest in other things. And I think it's kind of apropos that that you and I are talking, right? Because one of the things that ultimately I want to create a little bit more time for are some of the other work that I do around venture, supporting venture platforms around the world. And so, as that was the thing that drove me to working with you and Startup Istanbul, and that's important to me. But I do that in other markets as well. And I'm working on some things in the Middle East. I'm advising and on the LPAC of a couple funds in markets in Africa. And so there's some other things I'd love to, over time, have some more time to do. And some of that, by the way, will probably include continuing some relationship with venture firms in the U.S. I've been kind of toying around with what that might look like as well. But one of the funny things, I wrote this in my blog post about venture, is you make an announcement like this, and then I go back to my schedule. Right, I've got a full schedule of things. Today I'm in New York all next week with portfolio companies and meetings, and there's no like pack your banker's box, have your party, your go away party, and then, you wake up the next morning, you don't have anything to do. We have years and years and years of full-time work ahead of us at Foundry. So
when did you finalize this decision, and how are you feeling personally about this moving into the next phase of your career?
well, it's a good day to ask me that question. So I knew that I was not going to be a partner in the next Foundry fund well over a year ago. I mean, really, when we were raising this last fund, so in the last couple of years, I said to my partners, I had actually toyed around with the idea of not even being a full partner in the 2022 fund. And for a bunch of reasons, decided that it made more sense to continue on as a full partner. But when we were out raising this fund, I wasn't saying this to our LPs necessarily, but I said internally to my partners, hey, I'm pretty sure this is my last fund. And, over the last probably we talked about this over the last year or so, and it really got serious over maybe the last, I don't know, 6 months, something like that, where we really kind of felt like this is where we're headed. But we wanted to make sure we wanted to live with that for a little bit, because once you announce something like this, it's final. And so we wanted to give ourselves a little bit of time to just sit with that decision and see how it felt. It's a little bit of a surreal morning because it's, I was very excited about this. I've been saying relatively publicly on some podcasts and to friends and other people that I was planning on wrapping up after the 2022 fund. And so I had some experience with getting reactions to that, but it's still it makes it really real, right? I mean, you really, once you've announced it, I sent this morning when I posted the post to Foundry, I sent a Slack to my partners and I said, I guess there's no changing our minds now, right? There's no going back. And I got a bunch of responses like, oh my gosh, this is real. And so, it obviously feels different to have it out there. So it's nice to have this opportunity to talk about it. Barak, I mean, really, I'm planning on mostly just talking through the post that we wrote and, talking through the Foundry post, but it's kind of nice to have an opportunity this morning. I don't know when this is going to actually drop, but to talk about it and kind of process in real time with you the emotions of, having it actually be real.
So will you remain active on boards during the wind down, or how do you expect the closure impact the Foundry portfolio companies, by the way?
Yeah, I mean, I wrote a note to the CEOs that I work most closely to, and I sort of jokingly said, you're kind of stuck with me, and you probably get more of my time now because, we've got, again, as I said, we've got a couple years left in the investment period, so sort of nothing changes, today and tomorrow. But at some point in a couple years, we won't be looking at new investments, and so that'll free up quite a bit of time. And nothing will change in terms of my work with the portfolio. I'm not planning on changing my board load or doing anything like that. And in fact, part of why I'm making this decision is I want to recognize that instead of dropping things to make room for some of the other things that I'd like to do, what I'd like to do is sort of have a nice managed, sort of natural churn of companies, right? We'll sell companies, it's a venture business, so probably a few will not make it. And so ultimately, I'll see that board load go down. I've been trying, Barak, to be really deliberate about my Foundry work for years now, because I recognize some of the scale limitations of venture, and I've spent a lot of time, energy, and money on some personal coaching for myself on sort of productivity and how to be more effective and how to work with my companies, with my partners, with the person that supports me, to create more space for the work that really matters in this business, which is working with my portfolio that I'm responsible for, and then looking at new investments. And so I think that this announcement just helps me kind of create even more space for that over time. But as I sort of referenced earlier, but I mean, I did say to my partners, I mean, I will be at Foundry until we are absolutely done. I am volunteering to wind things down, and I recognize that 5, 6, 7, 8 years from now, some of my partners may have some other things that they want to do, and I'm happy to take some of their work on. I know Brad, I know Chris Moody feel the same way. There is no next thing for me that is like joining another firm and becoming a partner, right? There's whatever it is that I do next will be something that's not full time, if you will, right? I'm very interested in finding ways to stay closer to founders. I've got a couple of ideas around that. I've got a few years before I can even start thinking about exploring those. So lots of time to think about it.
Another follow-up questions. I mean, I have lots of questions, but I will keep several questions for this topic because I have already prepared lots of questions, your experiences and startups and VCs. But this was a today's, surprise news. So, how do you expect Foundry's closure will affect the broader startup ecosystem, especially in Colorado and nationally?
Yeah. I mean, I don't Foundry has occupied a certain space in the venture world, and I hope that we've been a good example for other funds. I don't. There's plenty of the world is awash in capital. Like I don't think anyone's going to really notice that Foundry is gone. You touched on, I think, an important point though, which is that inside Colorado, obviously Foundry, is a large firm, and although our investment focus is across the U.S. because we're located in Colorado, there sort of is a disproportionate, if you will, amount of investment that we at least look at in Colorado. But that said, I feel like there are great new investors that are sort of the up and comers in Colorado, and Moxie and Matchstick and Range, and there's a whole bunch of people that I really I respect and I'm excited for, and I think they're already doing amazing things. They weren't waiting for Foundry to step aside, and I feel like I think it creates great opportunity for others to step up. I also feel like I'm not moving from Colorado, right? So and my partners all live there as well. So hopefully we can contribute to that ecosystem, and just in different ways than we contribute to it now.
I mean, having been in venture capital industry since 2001, I think more than 20 years, this period of significant changes. Can you describe how the US market has evolved over these 2 decades? How has the concept of American dream evolved?
Well, I mean, the thing to remember is that the venture industry in the US was a pretty small cottage industry, really up until kind of the mid to late 90s, right? I mean, it was really kind of the 95, 96 time period where venture started to take off. It got really crazy in the bubble period of 2000, at 99 and 2000. And then it had sort of a very long, slow decline through through the aughts, essentially, and it didn't really start taking off again until after the Great Recession of 2008 2009. It was more like 2000, kind of 10, 11, 12 that we started to see what became this explosion in venture. Obviously, we reached another kind of nadir in venture in the sort of 2020 timeframe, before things again kind of started to cool off. And I think there is a bunch of things that we learned from all of this. But one of those things is that the sort of pendulum of venture kind of swings slowly, right? Because it's a little bit of what I was describing, that you can decide that you don't want to raise another fund, or in many funds cases that you couldn't raise another fund, and you still have years and years and years of work to do. And I remember thinking in sort of 2002, 2003, that there would be far fewer venture firms sort of through that coming cycle, but also that it might take some time. And I think it took a really long time, right? I mean, it wasn't until sort of the 2008, 2009 period that we really saw the firms that had kind of stopped making new investments in 2001 and 2002. They finally had sort of worked through their portfolios enough to kind of wind themselves down. And I don't know exactly what we're going to see. Certainly, the venture industry is much bigger than it was back in kind of the early aughts. It just in terms of kind of the staying power. I mean, there are a lot more, I think, legitimate venture-backed companies now than there were back in the kind of the original bubble, if you will. And I think that's because software has become quite sort of ubiquitous. It's become more horizontal. We sometimes describe it as kind of eating the world, right? I mean, it's penetrated nooks and crannies of all of our existence in different ways. But that said, there's obviously the rise of AI. There's all this Web3. There's like so much still to come in venture, and I'm excited for for the next 20 years in venture. And I'm excited to be a little bit more towards the sidelines in that next 20 years and not in the middle. And I think those things for me kind of go hand in hand.
You have spoken about failures in meritocracy before. Do you think that the startup and VC world is true meritocracy? Why and why
No.
not?
No, I think it's not. And I think anyone who thinks it is not looking at the data. The data are very clear that both the people that tend to become venture capitalists skew male and white, and they skew wealthy. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. And perhaps more perniciously, well, I guess as perniciously, that the money that flows to founders also skews towards white male founders. So I don't think you can look at those data and say it's a meritocracy at all. And I think one of the things that I hope maybe we helped a little bit on, I don't know that I can look back on sort of what we've done and say that we really moved the needle on it, frankly. But that I hope for the next 20 years of venture, and I see this in our partner fund portfolio, is that we do finally start to make progress on becoming more of a meritocracy where more people with great ideas have access to venture. And I think one of the challenges of venture capital is that I think many people who are venture capitalists do believe that it's a meritocracy, right? For some reason, there's this belief in Silicon Valley in this sort of like, libertarianism, which I always find somewhat ironic because Silicon Valley was quite literally created by the federal government, right? It was a series of DARPA grants that sort of, helped both the internet get started, but also even before that, the microchip industry get going. And so, people make their money and then they become libertarian because they want to keep it, I guess. I don't really know what's behind that, but I feel like that is a little bit of people also saying, no, the world is a meritocracy. And I think that I don't believe that that's the case. I believe in meritocracy. Like I'm absolutely a capitalist at heart. And I would love to see us move more towards that. But meritocracy includes equal opportunity. And I don't think that exists.
So, following up these questions, what are the hidden aspects of Silicon Valley that outsiders like us cannot see, particularly for those who only learn about the US ecosystem through social media, blogs, and podcasts? What are the challenges and downsides of being a startup founder in US? Maybe dark side of the Silicon Valley that haven't been taught or shared.
I think that founders sometimes don't appreciate how much of the venture business, particularly as it's practiced in bubble periods, and we saw this a lot, consists of buying options. And I think when founders take an investment, they think of that as sort of a true partnership, and that they're and they think of it as an investment, and from their perspective, it is. But I think a lot of VC firms see it as placing option bets. And when the bet looks like it's paying off, they pay a bunch of attention to it. And when it's not paying off, they kind of go away. And I think that that's, we saw that in the sort of grow at all cost mentality that pervaded sort of that's 2018 to 2021 period in particular, but often sort of takes over Silicon Valley. And that was very VC favorable, but not necessarily company favorable, right? And I think that oftentimes VCs do companies a disservice by focusing on that. And this is not every firm, it's not every investment, but I think by and large, that actually is this sort of hidden part of Silicon Valley. And the other thing I think that maybe founders don't always recognize, certainly I didn't even recognize this when I was in the venture industry initially as an associate. Eventually I became a partner and I started understanding more and more about how venture firms actually operate. But just how much of venture activity is and continues to be driven by fund side decision making, when a fund is raising, what they want to do with their marks to market and things like that. And I think that is often puts companies in conflict with their investors. And I think investors often believe that sort of what's good for them is good for companies, and that's sometimes not the case. I just had a conversation with one of our partner funds I'm not going to out them or the company, but he was describing a company vote that was coming up. He was asking my opinion for how to handle it. And some of the late stage he kind of gave me the whole lay of the land. And some of the late stage investors were clearly, like very clearly acting in their own interest as board members, right? I mean, as an investor, you can do whatever you want. You can act in your best interests, and you should expect your investors to ultimately act in their own best interests. But as board members, I didn't, and I gave this partner fund GP some questions to ask in the board meeting to try to sort of make sure that people understood that he was watching. He's a board member in this case too, but he was paying attention to the fact that they were potentially making decisions that were really not in the best interest of shareholders and not as fiduciaries of the company. So that's just one example of it. But that to me, those are kind of some of the, you asked that, sort of what are the hidden secrets of venture. But I come back to this. Venture capitalists are oftentimes buying options, and I think people don't, on the company side, don't realize that.
I think you studied psychology and economy in the university. How has the educational background influenced how you evaluate founders and teams when making investment decisions?
I think people look at my background in econ and psych, and they assume, I'm a VC, so therefore the econ really drives things. And I learned a lot in economics. I was a theoretical economics major. I actually hadn't taken a single business course. I'll tell you a funny story about learning how to do company analysis when I was a young analyst at Morgan Stanley in a second. So it was very sort of ethereal, lots of like econometric style models, like not the kind of stuff that we do as venture capitalists at all. And in fact, it wasn't even until my senior year that I finally got around to taking the accounting class that was required to actually be a major. And so actually, I think that my psychology major, like understanding people and what drives them, is a much more important foundation for me in my day-to-day work as a VC. And, I think one of the things that people sometimes forget about being a VC is that I don't really make a lot of decisions, right? I make investment decisions, right? And I make decisions around, I guess, hiring and firing of CEOs. Almost everything else I do is just influence, right? VCs don't operate businesses. I'm one of sometimes many board members on a board, and I have opinions about things, but I can't back those opinions up with any authority of any kind, right? I mean, all I can do is offer those opinions. So really, I'm in the influence game. And so that means I need to be a good listener, and that means I need to be able to synthesize a lot of different data points. But then it also means I need to be able to communicate that to a CEO or management team or the rest of the board in a way that that influences people's decisions. Because all I can do is say, hey, here's how I might frame something. Occasionally, I even say this is what I think we should do, or this is what I would do. But a lot of it is sort of guiding people in the direction that I'm thinking about, but without having any real authority to back that up. And so, and that's probably something else about venture. But back to your last set of questions that I think people don't necessarily realize. And by the way, if you have an investor that's trying to operate your business, that's not their role. That's not what they should be doing.
That's true. Very quick questions regarding to your decision-making process. Can you walk me through the decision-making process or framework when considering any decision like hiring or making new investments, for example?
Yeah. So a couple things to start out with. One is that I often in a boardroom will ask to clarify, is this a decision topic or a discussion topic? Because for starters, I want to understand, are we actually making a decision as a board? Sometimes that's because we are required as a board, right, as fiduciaries to sign off on something. Sometimes that's because the CEO will say, hey, I'm not comfortable making this decision on my own. I would like this to be a group decision. But it's important to clarify that, right? Because sometimes you get into a discussion and or into a discussion at a board level, and you think, or certain board members think that they're there to make the decision, but actually the CEO is just looking for input. And I think that's really important. So I start with that. The other thing I always start with is I have a very important mantra, which is don't panic, gather information, make an informed decision, and the order matters. And I see all over the place people mixing up the order, right, or panicking, right, to start out with. And I think it's really important. There are emergent situations that come up occasionally in venture, not as many as I think people think. But I always follow that mantra, first principles. Like, let's not panic, can't make decisions based on emotion. There's almost always a need to get a little bit of information. And, that can vary, right? Hey, if we need to make this decision today, then okay, well, we can get the information we can get. But I'm rarely on a call where we need to make a decision this second and we don't have a moment to step back and get data. And then you use the data to make an informed decision. So for me, that framework is really, really important. And as part of that, I often try to clarify, hey, when do we need to make this decision by, right? Because I think sometimes people are apt to put artificial deadlines in front of them. And it's not that I want to take time that is an inordinate amount of time, but I want to have time typically to gather information. I also feel those are the most important things. That's how you approach a decision. I also think it's really important to listen a lot. I rarely, when someone asks me my opinion, I will rarely just sort of spout it back to them, right? I almost always will ask for a second. Sometimes it's just, and I'll say that sometimes. My CEOs I work with get used to this. It's kind of a funny tick of mine, but where someone will ask me something and I'll say, give me a second. I just need a minute of silence just to think about this for a second. I'm going to give you an answer, but I need a second to just test it in my head. I like that. And I like running through that. I also like to be really clear about what the framework looks like. And I almost always lead with that, again, because I feel like my role is rarely to be the person making the decision. And so oftentimes I'll walk up to that decision with a CEO, but what I'm really doing is saying, this is how I would look at the framework of that. Let's talk about some of the pieces that might influence that and make sure that we're on the same page about it. And then they end up coming to the conclusion that's the right conclusion without me having to say it. Because I want them to feel like they have that agency, because they run these businesses. So oftentimes we'll start with that framework. I will almost always sort of list out my assumptions. Here's how I'm thinking about this framework. Here's sort of what's influencing my view. You've asked me for my opinion, and I'm going to give it to you, but here's what's influencing in that. And then I'll give them the opinion. And then I'll also typically tell them how strongly I feel about that. Right. And I think that's also really important. I have a style of speaking. My partners joke with me about this, that I sound very definitive about things that I often am not particularly definitive about. And I think that's just, I don't know, I'm loud, I talk fast, or whatever it is. And so I typically have learned this to clarify with people, hey, you've asked me my opinion. If we've gone through the framework, I've given you sort of my assumptions. Here's my actual opinion. And just to be clear, I'm a 62%, right? That's probably more accurate than it typically is. But I feel, I'm 90%. Like I feel this pretty strongly. Or hey, I'm like kind of 50-50, right? Like I this is probably what I do, but I don't feel super strongly about it. And you may have more data than I have, which is why I've just told you what the framework and the sort of the assumptions were. All of those things I think are important. Again, Barack, I'm not in a decision business. I'm in the influence business. And so I think it's really important to be clear about sort of what's behind your opinions on things. I also think that makes your opinions more likely to be adopted as well when it matters. But the other thing that I think that, if I were just to give myself kudos, if that's okay, I think others would say this, is I think I'm really good at letting go of something, even when I believed in it pretty strongly. Like I'm when I'm just convinced that I was wrong, or it's clear that that's just not the decision we're going to make, then you really need to learn to let that go. And I think that's something that boards often do wrong. Someone will have a very strong opinion about something, and they just can't let it go, right? And it comes up meeting after meeting after meeting, and it's like, look, we made this decision, and now it's done, and it's behind us. And I think that that's a really important it's taken me some time to learn that skill. I'm a pretty stubborn person, and so it's not always in my nature to be like, okay, I felt strongly about this, but we're going in a different direction, and I agree. Or, hey, I felt strongly about this, but now I have some new data, and I'm giving it up. But I think it's really important to have that flexibility. Sometimes people describe that as strong opinions loosely held. It's taken my partners, I think, a little bit of time to get used to that as well, because I will often stress test something by taking the other side, which I totally don't agree with, but it helps me process through something, and it's taken them a minute to realize sometimes. And sometimes now I'll raise my hand and say, hey, I'm just steel manning this for a second. So, how about if we take the other side, and this is what that looks like to me? And now they're sort of used to it, and now we kind of debate it. And I almost debate myself sometimes, and then I come back and like, yeah, no, that was a stupid framework to think about it. That what we're talking about, I agree.
So how do the startup boards meetings typically work in your experience, and what have you been? What have been some of the biggest lessons that you have learned from serving on the boards of the startups?
Well, maybe we can put in the show notes. I wrote a series of blog posts on how to run an effective board meeting, which really was sort of based on years and years and years of some effective, some not so effective board meetings, right? And I think effective board meetings. Well, actually, let me start with the ineffective board meetings. Ineffective board meetings look like management team meetings, right? They look like, and there's some signs of it. Where every manager gets to talk at every board meeting. The board packages are 50 pages, 80 pages, right? I mean, you get these huge board packages where the data, there's so much data in the board package that it's hard to even parse what's going on, right? Good board meetings allow companies and boards to focus on what's important. If you're just vomiting data at the board, you're not really telling them what you think is important, right? And I think a lot of board meetings focus too much on the what and not enough on the why. What I want to hear about, especially when I'm in a meeting, the worst thing in the world is to travel somewhere, especially if it's for only one board meeting, and sit through the management team meeting where everyone reports on what they did and they read their slides, because that's kind of what reporting is. And what we really want to do at a board meeting is distill what's most important at the company down to 20 slides, 25 slides. Like if it's more than that, you're really not focusing. And then really focus on the why, not the what. The what should go out ahead of time. People can ask questions about that at the beginning of the meeting if that's important. But really, you want to spend time on why. And that often means not everyone in the management team is at every meeting, because you're not going to cover every functional area in every meeting. You're going to pick a couple that you really focus on in that meeting. And then I like board meetings to have sort of one, it could even be tactical. I was about to say a strategic thing, but it could be tactical. But one thing that you deep dive as a board, at least, where you say, look, let's have a discussion topic around this, because I want to get the board's input on something that I think is really important. That could be product roadmap. That could be the decision to enter a market or not. That could be some other thing that's going on with the business. And I think those are effective board meetings, right? And I think that the board meetings, again, I think the signs, I hate, sorry to focus on the negative, I think it's easier to kind of point them out. But the signs that board meetings aren't effective are, I mean, I've been through some companies where there's 30 people in the room because they want every person, and the person that reports to them to be involved in it. I was on one board once. We would have 7-hour board meetings, which are ridiculous. We would have no breaks. Literally, they would just like, we're going to plow through this. If you need to go, use the restroom or, go get a snack, there's a table out there with snacks. You just step up and go, but we're going to keep going. And those had, 120-page board packets. I mean, it was absolutely ridiculous. The most effective board meetings I'm in are, as I said, board packages that are tighter. They go out well in advance so we can all read them. The board, by the way, the presentation at the board doesn't have to be what's sent ahead of time, right? I have several companies that send out a series of metrics that are not the vomit of metrics, but the stuff that we think is most important. And they maybe send a one-page write-up from sort of each of the key managers at the business. Always they include a CEO note that says, this is what I'm thinking about. This is what I'm worried about. This is where I want to focus in the board meeting. And maybe this is an area where I could use some help. And then we get into the board meeting, and oftentimes there's a presentation that accompanies what went out that we haven't seen yet. That's fine, but we all know what's going on in the business because we've had the write up, we've seen the metrics. The slides are essentially the same at every board meeting. Sometimes we take something away or add something if we need to, and then that really focuses the board meeting on the discussion of why are we seeing what we're seeing, and what do we need to think about in order to continue to build a business. So I would encourage people to read. I mean, I say it in much more detail in this series of blog posts. I think it's 5 or 6 blog posts, but I think those are really important.
I will add the links about that blog post as well to the comment. What are the 3 questions that you find yourself asking most frequently in the investment meetings, and maybe with the new startups, and the board meetings with the portfolio companies?
Well, sorry about that. In the investment meetings, I really like to start with how people came to the idea. I think understanding people's sort of motivations is most important. And there's lots of different ways that people come to, to found businesses. But that's my favorite investment question to ask. In board meetings, I often will try to hone in on both why is this an important topic to talk about? Like, why did you decide that this is the thing that we need to talk about? And to really understand what the CEO or the management team thinks the decision framework looks like. I want to understand how they're looking, not necessarily what is their opinion, but how are they looking at the question? What's the balance that they're trying to strike here? And I find, though, I don't know that those are trick questions. I mean, I think in the board context, those are pretty obvious questions. But what I've found is that people are too quick to kind of jump in with their own opinions. I had when I wasn't even a partner yet. It was still at Mobius. I had a meeting once. A CEO came out to see me, and she outlined. We were sitting in a conference room. She whiteboarded a bunch of stuff, and she outlined some stuff she was super frustrated in. And I immediately jumped into, okay, we should do this. We should do this. We should do this. Right? This is like 2003, so 20 years ago now. And she said, "Seth, stop. I'm still in the venting phase. I just need to vent for a second." And that's really, I mean, it's 20 years ago. It really stuck with me that it's so important to like stop, make sure you've heard everything, and make sure that you are answering the question that you want to have, that the CEO wants to have answered. That's another thing that maybe that is a trick question where I'll ask the CEO, the management team, let's be really clear about what question are you asking for advice on? Because what I found in board meetings is that people are so quick to jump in. And it's funny too, I've had this question a few times. We're often the lead investor in a business. Maybe because of check size. Maybe that's just, I'm these days, I'm like often the oldest VC in the room. But whatever it is, but I'm rarely the first person to speak to a question. And the reason is because someone always jumps in, right? Like someone's always like first in. I don't want to fight them for that. I'm a pretty deliberate person when it comes to answering questions. And so I just need time to think anyway. And so unless someone directs the question to me, in which case I will often say, give me just a second as I process, I'm almost never the first guy to speak. And I've just sort of come to be super comfortable with that. Like, I think that that's totally fine to let someone speak, let someone else speak. The other thing that I think is important, and this is more for the VCs that are listening to this, I don't find the need to opine on everything that comes up in a board meeting, right? Like it is not, it's like being on a panel at a conference. I hate those panels where the moderator asks a question and then each of the 4 or 5 panelists gives an answer, and then the moderator answers another question. Each of the 4 or 5 people, like you don't have to jump in on everything, right? I mean, I think oftentimes it's fine to say, hey, I don't have anything to add to this discussion. I think that was a really interesting point. Or, hey, I largely agree with what Sheila said, and I don't really have anything to add to that. I think that's a really important skill that I find that some VCs that are maybe earlier in their career, they think their job is to come in and offer suggestions on everything, right? And I don't think that that's our job, right? I think our job is to mostly listen, to offer frameworks, to offer suggestions when appropriate, and sometimes defer when I'm like, hey, I just don't feel like I have the data. I don't feel like I have an opinion on this, or it's not an area that I'm expert in. There's this cliche in venture that this reminds me of, by the way, which I absolutely hate, right? Which is that like VCs love to tell their investors, their LPs, I'm the first phone call, and I hate that, right? I always tell people, if you're the first phone call on every subject area on a board, you have a terrible board, right? You're really the expert in finance and HR and product and go to market, and like really you don't have anyone on the board who knows more than you do about any of those topics. Like that doesn't make any sense. You should be the go-to phone call for certain things, but you should have created a board that has this diversity of experience so that there's an obvious person or people to call on various subjects that aren't you, the VC. And I always find that cliche annoying, but that's also why I feel like if the venture investors are the first people that are talking on every subject, especially if it's the same person, you're kind of back into the like, why don't we let some other people who are experts in other areas, talk about this stuff?
So do you have any red flags or warning signs, especially in the first meetings from the founders or from the environment?
I think that one of my general warning signs for people, period, and we try to be very deliberate about this at Foundry, is when people use the sort of first person pronouns too much, right? It's okay to say, I have an opinion, right? That's your own opinion. But so much of what we do as a VC, we are Foundry, right? We are comprised of different partners, but when we are doing something, that's a we thing. When I talk about values that Foundry have, well, we have those values, not just I. So I think that's important, and that tends to be a red flag at companies as well when people talk about what they did. I did, and I think that's it's important to me. That's a flag to kind of dig further into it, because people accomplish a lot more when they are inclusive about it, when they're pulling more people in across a broader set of teammates, et cetera. And so that's kind of probably my one red flag that I think about the most.
I mean, I have a couple of last questions, by the way. I mean, you reflect a great successful career. Do you believe it was primarily due to luck or result of your hard work and dedication?
Luck is number one. I put this in my blog post. I was lucky in so many ways. I joined venture at a fortuitous time. I mean, more than anything, I worked for Brad Feld, right? Like, I think Brad is one of the best investors of our generation. And I was trained to be a venture capitalist by following him around for 5 years, which is the best way I could have ever imagined to learn venture. And I have him as a sounding board. I've had him as a sounding board for 23 years. And that was more than anything in my life. That was incredibly lucky. I was lucky to have my other partners who, we've had this incredible balance at Foundry. I was lucky to obviously invest in some incredible founders and have some incredible CEOs. So absolutely. And now that that doesn't mean I didn't have to work hard for that, but the cliche of like, luck comes to those who work hard. I believe that that's true, but luck, I think, plays a bigger role in life and in business than maybe people, give it credit for. So that's, for me, is number one on the list. And, but I also think that working hard has been helpful. And I hope having some amount of humility and really caring a lot about the practice of venture and how to be a good venture capitalist, like that matters a lot to me.
Are there any particular books or podcasts or other media you like to listen while cycling for long distances?
I devour books. So I'm a huge fan of Audible. We have this funny Audible account. I don't know why it ended up this way, but my wife, my teenage son, and I all share one Audible account. So he's really into Lord of the Rings and sort of that style fiction. And my wife and I listen to more similar things, but she has her own things that she listens to. So our library is really diverse. It's kind of funny. Sometimes I got to like hunt through it. But I mean, I listen to, I don't know, 20, 30 books a year. Like I really get through it a lot because I think it's helpful. So I've already picked a couple titles. I mean, obviously I wrote a book, so I would be remiss if I didn't mention The New Builders. I actually think it talks about some of the themes we talked about on this podcast in terms of meritocracy, sort of the evolution of venture and the diversification of entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship much more broadly than just venture-backed entrepreneurship. So I would certainly recommend that. I really liked Subtract by Lodi Katz. That was one that really spoke to me. I really liked both of the Annie Potts books. I think those were really, really interesting that talk about decision making and how we make decisions. So those are some that kind of come to mind as books that I've read recently-ish that really stick with me. So those are things that I think I get a lot out of reading. I do listen to quite a few podcasts, but they tend to be kind of all over the place, right? And some of them are psychology podcasts, Hidden Brain, things like that. I listen to a couple of venture podcasts, Tim Ferriss, All In, things like that. And then I listen to a handful of current event podcasts as well. Things like Pod Save the World or America and Opening Arguments. Strict Scrutiny, because I'm kind of interested in legal stuff, things like that. So all great things to kind of keep me distracted. I have a general rule on podcasts. I don't have to listen to every episode because it just gets a little bit overwhelming. I just listed off like 6 or 7 podcasts that, probably put 10 or 15 podcasts a week out. So, that would be a lot to listen to, but I try to create time, as you referenced, often when I'm working out, riding my bike, going for a run, something like that, or driving. Because that's important to me. And obviously, books are important as well. So,
By the way, how did you first get into the cycling, and how many hours do you ride in a typical week?
My wife, when I met my wife, she had a lot of friends who were cyclists, and she really encouraged me to ride. I owned a bike, but I wasn't like really, I wasn't as serious about it. I also found, and that was kind of what got me, sort of initially interested. I also found it was a great way to, meet people, have meetings, expand my network. Certainly in Boulder, Longmont, where I live, there are a lot of group rides, and it was a good way to meet some folks. I liked that I can listen to podcasts and things like that. I probably 50-50 riding by myself versus riding with friends. So it's the winter time here, so I'm not riding a ton, but I like to ride or run, call it, I don't know, 20 hours a week, something like that. I mean, that feels like a good amount of time. I've gotten more into running. It's sort of such an efficient way. I hated running, and then I agreed with my partner Ryan for his 50th birthday. I would run. He was going to run a marathon, and instead of just doing the obvious thing, which is like, hey, why don't I'll be at the finish line with beer for you. I was like, oh, I'll run it too, and I'm a terrible runner. So I got into it because I used one of these programs. They tell you what to run every day, and but after 3-4 months of running, whatever it was, I don't know, 40 miles a week or something like that, which for me was a lot. I ended up, I really liked it. So I've kind of balanced out my cycling with some running as well. Cause it's, if you go for a bike ride, it's got to be like an hour and a half, or it's not even really worth it. I mean, maybe an hour if you're going uphill or something like that. But, but for a run, you could do a 5K and, go run for, for 25 minutes or whatever it is, and feel like you got a good workout in. So I kind of like that. So anyway, but I do like sports where I can listen to books and podcasts. That's the most important thing.
So, if you go back to the 20 years ago, what advice would you give your younger self today?
It all sounds cliche. Like the first things that come to my mind are like, it's like prepare yourself for this long journey, right? But also, I think I wish I had been more deliberate. A couple things actually that I think are a real piece of advice. I wish I'd been more deliberate about how to scale my own time. I failed at it miserably. There was a moment in probably 2012 when I just truly hit the wall and was like, I just can't keep working at this speed. And I wish I had invested in myself and in some of the tools that and the coaching that helped me expand my ability, my capacity. But also, as part of that, I started approaching my work differently, and I realized I didn't need to do all the things that I thought I needed to do. And I think when I was earlier in my venture career, I thought I needed to be at every event, to go to everything, to be working on every problem that every company had. And I feel like when I hit the wall, I became increasingly better at not feeling like I needed to do all of those things. And in many cases these days, I'll look around a boardroom if we come up with something and say, okay, who's going to do this? I don't think I'm the best person to help with this specific thing. And I think that that's really helped me sort of create time to focus on the things that really matter in my work, but also outside of my work. And I think I wish I had understood that, when I was earlier in my career, when my kids were younger. I mean, all of that stuff, right? I mean, you run around like crazy, and I think it was not sustainable clearly for me, and I wish I could have done that quite a bit differently. And I think it would have started with focusing on a smaller set of things where I could really be impactful, and really being thoughtful about how do I manage my time and how do I manage my workflow to gain leverage.
Seth, thank you very much. It was always a pleasure to talk with you.
Barak, I really enjoyed it. Next time in Istanbul, I'd love to see you out there.